Before we let you go, Marz, I want to do another historical conversation because, again, I think that that's one of the really fun things to talk about with you. I had a tweet a couple weeks ago where I put out my top 22 offensive peaks in NBA history in tiers. Players were not ranked within the tiers, but I just know that you have takes on this, and so I want to get those takes. I want you to tell me what you disagree with most. And Logan, I want you to do the same, but we'll start with Marz. But for anybody who does not have this tweet up in front of them, I'm just going to go through the tiers. Tier 1, Jokic, Jordan, LeBron, Curry, Magic. Again, players are not ranked within the tiers. Tier 2, Bird, Oscar, Shaq, Kareem, Nash, Wilt, Luka, Kevin Durant. Tier 3, Shea, Kobe, Jerry West, Dirk Nowitzki, Charles Barkley, and James Harden. Tier 4, Giannis, CP3, and Akeem. Marz, what makes you angriest out of those tiers? What do you disagree with most?
I responded to that tweet, and the first thing I said was, I don't know what more Steve Nash has to do to be tier 1. So I guess my biggest disagreement was Steve Nash being in that tier 2. For me personally, I think he's very, very clearly a tier 1 offensive player. I think the results speak for themselves. I think he's the second best passer of all time. I think he's probably the best half-court passer of all time.
Is that above Jokic? You have Magic 1?
Yeah, I have Magic 1. I'd have Magic 1, Nash 2, Jokic 3, probably. I think as a decision maker, I actually think he's the best decision maker I've ever seen. Being able to manufacture easy opportunities for his teammates at a rate that no one's ever been able to. I think he's one of the 5 best shooters of all time. And for me, the 2 most valuable things an offensive player can do is pass the ball and shoot the ball. Those are the 2 most valuable things. And Steve Nash is the only player in NBA history who I think has a strong case, to be top 5 at both of those things in the history of the game. Passing, I don't think is a question. Shooting, I can understand people saying he didn't shoot enough threes, but when you look at his free throw percentages year after year, I think he's second all time to Steph Curry. When you look at his ability in the mid-range, I think he was one of the highest mid-range efficiency players of all time. I believe he led the league in true shooting before. From 3, it wasn't the highest volume, but routinely a 40% three-point shooter, sometimes 45, 46%. So just the overall shooting ability was insane. And then his handle, he wasn't the flashy Kyrie Irving type handle where it's like he's able to just knife through defenses by doing a bunch of ridiculous things you've never seen before. But the ability to never pick up your dribble is something that I find very valuable. It's called, what is it called? Nashing, when you're dribbling around in circles in the paint. Defenses not being able to force you to pick up your dribble is extremely valuable because it doesn't limit what you're able to do. When you pick up your dribble, now you can only pass or shoot. Steve Nash was never limited to what he could do because his dribble was always alive. And I alluded to it with Tyrese Halliburton, his ability to play the game at his pace, but his pace was frantic, was extremely valuable. If you're able to speed the game up and have possessions feel like they're transition possessions, you're going up against defenses that aren't set, or you're able to make defenses go into rotation. That's extremely valuable, and I think that's something that Steve Nash did at an elite level, maybe the best level of all time, and that's why he was responsible for some of the best offenses of all time in Dallas, in Phoenix, with D'Antoni, without D'Antoni. The results always remained the same. Even in 06, without Amari Stoudemire, they were the 2nd or 3rd ranked offense in the NBA. Second ranked offense behind only the Dallas Mavericks. Like, Steve Nash, I think the results speak for themselves, the skill set speaks for themselves. The playoff translation, he never won a championship, but his offense was never the problem. The Phoenix Suns have some of the best playoff offenses we've ever seen as well. And this is all because of Steve Nash and his playmaking. And we spoke about Halliburton's basketball, doesn't do him justice. 17-10 or 15-11 does not do Steve Nash justice. No. He's one of the best offensive players I've ever seen. And I think he's very, very clearly a tier 1 offensive player. So that was my biggest grievance.
Chad, clip that.
That's a really good take, dude. And like, Nash is maybe the dude who I considered putting in tier 1 the most. I would say that he and Larry Bird were the 2 dudes who were closest to being
That's the
in
one
that
I
tier
disagree
1 for
with
me.
most. I think Larry should be in tier 1.
We'll get to that in a second. But basically the reason that I didn't include Nash in tier 1 is I viewed my tier 1 as being comprised of 5 different guys who made 5 distinct cases for being the offensive GOAT, where basically, depending on the criteria that you value, I can see the case. If you want the greatest scorer of all time and this tremendous off-ball value, Michael Jordan makes his case. If you want the greatest gravity, the greatest guy in terms of his off-ball value and his shooting ability to stress a defense, that's what Steph Curry is, the greatest offensive ceiling raiser ever. If you want sort of this combination of bully ball, top-tier scoring and passing, a lot of ball dominance, that's what you get from LeBron James at his absolute best offensively. If you want, in my opinion, the guy who just is the best offensive player ever, Nikola Jokic, with this crazy combination of overwhelming interior scoring and passing and doing all this while he can also space the floor at a high level, and he can impact the game off ball with his movement and with his screening, and he makes a ton of quick decisions, right? He's a totally one-of-one mold. And then it came down to, you have Magic Johnson and you have Steve Nash. And they're different offensive players, but to me they sort of fit into a similar mold, even though obviously Magic is 6'9" and Nash is 6'3", and Nash is an all-time great shooter, and Magic was a good jump shooter inside the arc, but didn't take threes at all. They're different in that sense. The way that they're similar is that you have these all-time guys leading up-tempo offenses, playing a ton in transition, relatively low volume scores, but super high efficiency scores, god-tier playmakers, both top 3 passers of all time, who could scale up their scoring when they needed to in the playoffs and are very ball dominant. To me, they were just in that sense pretty similar. And then I was like, I'm going to pick one of these two guys and I'm going to go with Magic Johnson. But the resume that Nash makes is unbelievable. And I think that he's one of the most divisive players in NBA history. And I do think that there is a right side, even though I don't have Nash in that tier 1. I have him knocking on the door. And I think there are a lot of people who look at his box score and just completely miss out on the historic impact that he did have. I think that he is the purest pick and roll talent that we've ever seen. Like you said, Marz, I mean, I might go as far as to say that he's a top 3 passer and shooter of all time simultaneously. The 3-point volume, like, it's just a product of era. By the way, the Suns were taking more threes than anybody else at the time, but from 2005 to 2010, Steve Nash shot 49% from mid-range and 44.5% from 3. That's what I would consider his offensive peak, his best years in Phoenix. Like, that's unfathomable, and that's on high volume. That's a big sample size. I looked every single one of those years. He was at least 96th percentile efficiency in terms of jump shooting off the dribble. In most of those years, he's 98th or 99th percentile efficiency. And then his ability to manufacture assists at the rim out of pick and roll, his mid-range ability, his floater ability. I mean, a lot of the greatest offenses in NBA history were engineered by Steve Nash. The reason that I prefer Magic just slightly is I think that Magic was ultimately the better scorer. I think that although Nash has some incredible scoring performances in the playoffs, you look at like the 2005 series against Dallas, and he could ramp up his scoring volume and maintain really good efficiency, elite efficiency. I think Magic showed even more of an ability to do so, could get up into the 20s in terms of his scoring volume more consistently, just had more physical advantages at his size, could manufacture a little bit more of the easy stuff. And then I do think that he's an even greater passer than Nash. I think that all of the passing angles that were available to him at his size, I think he's clearly the greatest transition passer ever. I do think, although Nash pushed pace at a comparable level to Magic, Magic's scoring threat downhill at 6'9" puts him a tier above Nash as an overall transition player to me. I think it's only him and LeBron in that top 2 all-time in transition. And I think Nash was audacious as a passer, but Magic even more so. I mean, the windows that he would try and consistently connect on to feed teammates, just unbelievable. And both these guys led, like, realistically, the 2 greatest runs of team offense in NBA history. Shout out to what Oscar did with the Royals in the 60s, where they were like an automatic number 1 offense. That's the other example that you could mention up against these two. But, I mean, just fewer teams in the league. It's not as crazy to be the number 1 offense. The 80s Lakers were almost an automatic number 1 offense. And the 2000s Steve Nash-led teams, if it's in Dallas or if it's in Phoenix, where I think he deserves even more of the credit because I think he went up a level, and obviously he didn't also have Dirk, who was capable of leading elite offenses in his own right. Like, he led 9 straight top 2 offenses and 6 number 1 offenses in that time. I think that Magic led 5 number 1 offenses, maybe even more than that, in the 80s. So I have no problem with Nash being in anyone's tier 1. My rationale, again, was just the way that I was looking at it from the distinct offensive GOAT cases. And if I was going to choose one of those low-volume scoring, genius playmaking, ball-dominant point guards, I was going to take Magic over Nash. That's the only reason he's not in my tier 1, basically.
It hurts, but it makes sense. It hurts, but it makes sense.
I'm sorry, man. I hate to hurt it because I love Nash. I love Steve Nash. I do. I think he's a joy to watch. Logan, do you have anything you want to add to Nash, or do you want to talk about Bird?
I just don't get how you can say all those things and not have him in tier 1. I don't know, kind of like Marz said, I think the offensive results speak for themselves. And
you would have Nash in your tier 1 offensively?
Ever? I would. I'd also have Bird, I think. I think when, Marz talking about the most valuable things you can do are pass and score, pass and shoot at a high level offensively. And I just feel like Bird's different because Bird, and I think situation is important too, right? Like Steve is manufacturing all these looks for people, and maybe that's where you disagree, is that Bird's not like that on-ball guy because, they could run stuff through McHale. But I think his malleability is like his superpower, like his super strength and his ability to fit anywhere, any era, any team. I think Bird would make them a great offense. And so I can hear, like, because Bird wasn't as dominant as a ball handler, I could hear the case for him being in like tier 2. Mm-hmm. I was confused as to why Chris Paul was in tier 4, though. I feel like Chris Paul is a tier 3 guy for me. Like, wherever Harden is, I feel like Chris Paul's got to be in the same tier or above him.
Can I talk about Bird real quick
James
first?
Harden.
Okay, we'll get back to that. I just want to explain why I didn't have
sorry,
Bird
Marz.
in my tier 1.
I'm not a Harden guy. I never have been, man.
Clearly. But
okay. So I used to have Bird in my tier 1 offensively. He used to be the 6th guy for me. And then I thought, with the same criteria that I was applying that kept Nash out, I thought, what could possibly be the criteria that I value that makes me think Larry Bird is a better offensive player than Nikola Jokic? And I realized there is none. If I want that sort of off-ball movement, if I want that sort of quick decision-making as a passer, I can get a bigger, stronger,
fully evolved version of Bird. Like, it's a good argument, but like
basically, man, if I want a guy who can be more overwhelmingly efficient, which Bird wasn't, his true shooting percentage was consistently a few points above league average, but not like Jokic. Like, what if I could put Larry Bird in a 7-foot, 280-pound body, and I could make him an even
that's
better
the comp.
Passer?
I think that is the comp for Jokic, is big
and
Larry
I can make
Bird.
him an elite screener and an incredible offensive rebounder. Jokic just has more overwhelming advantages, and I think that he has basically all the same A-plus strengths that Larry does. Larry's a better shooter and is more comfortable doing so in tight windows, and his release is quicker, but Jokic is still an incredible shooter, one of the great mid-range shooters we've seen, and now he's 44% from deep on legitimate volume. That's what it came down to. Like, Larry's right there. I agree. His malleability is unbelievable. He's one of the greatest plug-and-play offensive players ever. I think he's the best touch passer. We've seen he could just do so many things for you. His cutting, his feel is unbelievable, and that makes him an A-plus offensive player anywhere. It's just like, all those same things make Jokic an A-plus offensive player anywhere. And then, like, if I also need somebody who can just absolutely destroy anybody in single coverage out of the post and just walk into a 65 to 70% shot in the paint off the roll or out of the post because he has the greatest paint touch we've ever seen, that's what Jokic gets me. So that's why I didn't have Larry in my tier 1. Shall we talk about Harden versus CP3? Or why I had CP3 in tier 4? The reason that I had CP3 in tier 4 and not in tier 3, I think basically comes down to the fact that I feel like everybody in tier 3 has some pretty overwhelming advantages. Shea, we talked about his scoring enough. Kobe, we've talked about his scoring enough. Jerry West, I mean, just utterly dominant scorer. His ability to get to the rim at a high rate, to get to the line at a high rate, and then also be a really effective pull-up shooter, jump shooter, and develop into a really great playmaker. I mean, there's not a lot of dudes who could routinely average 29 and 8 on absurd efficiency, regular season and playoffs, and that's what Jerry West did. Dirk just led so many elite offenses throughout the 2000s. Every single year of that decade, I believe they are a top 8 offense. In most years, they're like a top 3 offense, and they remained elite offenses after Nash left, I just think his overall scoring ability is some of the greatest we've ever seen. His ability to space the floor, obviously, but I would probably say he's the greatest isolationist of the 2000s. Just a walking mismatch, underratedly agile, underratedly elite at getting to the line at his prime. So that's why I think even though he's not a great playmaker, his scoring was so valuable. It made him that level of an offensive engine. Barkley, I mean, God tier efficiency, God tier offensive rebounding, really good playmaking, super versatile scoring forward. Literally led the league in true shooting percentage 4 straight years. And this guy was 6'5". Like, we've never seen anything like that since, especially from a star. And then Harden, like, yeah, we can talk about the playoff dropping, but again, the playoff dropping is still to pretty great production. And there were a whole lot of teams who could do absolutely nothing with James Harden. And they resorted to trapping him the second that he passes half court. And they resorted to guarding him from behind. And all of these gimmicks and oddities that, like, just speak to his greatness as an offensive player. Logan, you're really low on Harden, because there were a lot of people who were upset that I had Harden in tier 3 and not higher. And the reason I didn't have him higher is because of my issues with him in the playoffs. But CP3, I love the guy. It's just very ball dominant, efficient, but not top tier efficiency, because he doesn't get himself a ton of that easy stuff around the rim. The assist numbers are massive, and he is a great passer. But I think there are a lot of people who would look at Nash's box score compared to CP3 and say, well, how are they 2 tiers apart? Or how would you guys maybe even have them 3 tiers apart or whatever? If you have Nash in tier 1, I mean, the efficiency gap is real. CP3 is a great shooter. He's not close to Steve Nash's level as a shooter. And the passing gap, I think, is still real. I think that we talk about audacity and aggression. You have to take some chances to create the most valuable shots, those being basically assists for your teammates at the rim. And I think that Nash was significantly better at that than Chris Paul, if we're to compare those two. So when it comes to CP3 versus Harden, I just think Harden's overwhelming scoring peak while still being a great passer, not CP3's level. I prefer that because I know that you don't like the style that you get with Harden, Logan. And CP3 has more versatility as a shot maker because he's such a mid-range titan. But like, CP3 is also super ball dominant. So it's not like he has the advantage of being like a guy who's going to scale in a ton of situations in a way that Harden doesn't. So yeah, to me, it's basically about the scoring gap. I think Harden left defenses helpless more often than CP3 did.
Yeah, I don't think they're really comparable as scorers. I think there's a really wide gap there, but it's like, I still do think CP's more selfless. Like, he's looking to set up his teammates for shots. I just feel like that inherently, that style of play is going to lead you to wearing down. It's going to lead you to being tired in the playoffs. And Chris Paul thrived in every situation that he ever played in.
100%.
Like, you could drop Chris Paul. And I guess you could say the same thing about Harden, because Harden was that Rockets offense. I mean, it's him going to work every possession. And I value that to a decent level. It's just,
I think underratedly, then he went out and he led great offense in Brooklyn when he was healthy. And he, even way past his prime, was still able to produce really good offensive results in Philly and the Clippers. And obviously, now he can't finish at the rim at all, so he's not remotely the same player. Like, CP3 kind of has this unique historical opportunity of, like, being transported from situation to situation and killing it in every one, no doubt. But, like, if you put CP3 with prime LeBron, is he at his most effective? Like, obviously, he worked alongside Harden, but that was a very different version of CP3, where it was a lot more about his isolation scoring. It wasn't these insane assist numbers.
Marz,
Like,
as a Harden enthusiast, do you think he should be in tier 3, or are you closer to him being in tier 2? He should be, or are we still too low on him? Where do you come down on this?
I mean, personally, I would probably have Kobe a tier higher and probably have Harden a tier higher as well. I'm not as high on Charles Barkley, but I think Harden in tier 3 makes sense when you factor in the playoff dropping is important insofar as, like, if we're a team that is reliant on what you're producing for us in the regular season to have a chance, and then you fall off, we have a lesser chance because you're not performing at the level we needed you to perform at. So I think that's relevant. I also think Harden is being generally underrated by the fact that his team got hurt in 2018, so they didn't win a championship. But I think I would probably have him tier 2, but I see the case for tier 3. Kobe, I would also have tier 2. But yeah, for me, Harden and Chris Paul, with all due respect to Chris Paul, I'm not really thinking twice about that. I do think the scoring is a huge advantage. The attention that James Harden draws while being an elite playmaker. Being blitzed at half court, you're creating 4-on-3s with the whole court available to you.
Yeah.
And then being the best isolation scorer I think the game has ever seen, while being one of the best 3-point shooters. He was shooting 10 pull-up threes a game. Like,
it's ridiculous. He shot 540 step backs in 2019.
It's unfathomable volume. And pull-up threes is something a defense can't take away, especially step backs. You can't take away step back threes unless you guard him from behind, which a team tried. So, like, being able to generate that many threes off the bounce for yourself, at the clip he was doing it in 2018, 37% on 13 threes a game, is ridiculous. Then being able to get to the free throw line, we may not like it. It may not be aesthetically pleasing. But when you're shooting 14 threes a game and still shooting 12 free throws, that's ridiculous. Like, we're talking about the most efficient shots on the court, and you're able to generate them on demand in a way that Chris Paul really just didn't. He was hovering around the elbows, he was probing, he was just putting guys in jail. Like, these are all very valuable traits, but James Harden was just terrorizing defenses with the pressure he was putting on them from the most dangerous areas of the floor. So that's why I would have James Harden in tier 2, but definitely above Chris Paul. So no disrespect to Chris Paul though.
I'd be much more inclined to move CP3 up, certainly, than I would be to move Harden down. I mean, I think this is as low as you can have Harden. CP3 really was a great offensive floor raiser, and the offensive on-off numbers for him a lot of these years are pretty ridiculous. And, I mean, the Lob City offenses were historic, like underratedly so. Back-to-back number 1 offenses.
You made DeAndre Jordan an all-NBA first-team center,
I mean, you give him a lob threat, bro, and they're going to feast. There's no question about that. CP3 is amazing. I do think that Harden, more of an overwhelming advantage creator, certainly in a different stratosphere as a scorer. But you are making me consider if CP3 should be in tier 3. This was hard about doing things in tiers. Because, like, I think that Harden is clearly better than CP3. But could they be in the same tier? I don't know. Because I think that CP3 is a better offensive player than Giannis and Hakeem, who I have him in the same tier with. Maybe I should have just done my top 20 offensive peaks and had CP3 alone in tier 4. But also I was like, Hakeem, his scoring peak is absolutely nuts. Giannis, the level he's at right now, the playmaking that you get with his just overwhelming physicality and athleticism, pretty insane.
I wouldn't have had
players.
Hakeem personally. I wouldn't have had Hakeem.
You wouldn't have?
Nah.
He was the guy who I was probably lowest on out of these 22. Like, I would say it's him and Giannis, but Giannis has gotten to that level as a passer. The thing is just, like, 94, 95 Hakeem, man. And especially how it's scaled to the playoffs. That scoring peak is absurd. And no, he's not the most efficient, but he's giving you a 95, 33 a game. Across those 2 runs, I think it's over 31 a game. Still on, like, slightly plus relative true shooting. And he was a solid, I would say, above average passing big at that time. So he doesn't have that ability to manufacture the super easy stuff for himself or to reach that super high efficiency ceiling that he would have to be in tier 1, tier 2, or even tier 3. But I see it in tier 4.
Yeah, I probably would have just had Chris Paul by himself. And just
that's fair. No, that's totally
That's probably
fair.
what I would have done. Because I think he's clearly above Giannis and Hakeem.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
But yeah,
I felt really weird about having a tier of one guy. Because I actually did consider that. And then I was like, is that a tier or this is just Chris Paul? I guess I could put Cliff Paul in there with him, but that didn't come to me at the time. But, like, is there anybody who you would have higher than Hakeem, or do you just think CP3 is clear of Hakeem by enough that they shouldn't be in the same tier?
Well, yeah, I do think Chris Paul is clearly ahead of Hakeem. Anyone who I would have higher than Hakeem? I would really have to think about that.
Yeah. Not to put you on the spot, I was just
I do think Damian Lillard is an honorable mention.
Fair.
I do think Damian Lillard is someone who, you look around 2019 to 2023, like that period of Damian Lillard. 2022 notwithstanding, he was hurt. But like you look at that period of Damian Lillard where I think Damian Lillard has the deepest range in NBA history. I hesitate when I say it because obviously I'm talking about Steph here, but
Yeah.
I do think he has the deepest range in NBA history. I do think he did force defenses into some of the more aggressive coverages, especially out of pick and roll from the range in which he was a threat. And then he was a monstrous pick and roll player. He was making offenses with Yusuf Nurkic, who was good at this time. Once upon a time, there was a time where Yusuf Nurkic was a good player. But he was making these offenses perform like the best offense in the sport. And they weren't to that level. And it was solely because of Damian Lillard and his scoring threat. He's another high volume 3-point shooter who was elite at getting to the line. I think that's the one thing that Steph has like really missed in his career. He's the high volume 3-point shooter who doesn't really get to the line at a level like Dame does. Dame is relentless, shooting 8-9 free throws a game while being a high volume 3-point shooter. And he was a good enough passer with the gravity he commanded to where I do think he probably would be in this tier 4 for me.
You're right.
Ahead of a guy like Hakeem, maybe even Giannis. So that's probably where I would.
Honestly, I should have had Dame in this tier if I was going to include Giannis and if I was going to include Hakeem. I just agree with that flat out. I think 2023 Dame is just like one of the greatest offensive seasons ever, honestly. What he did, they were better than a 90th percentile offense when he was on the floor with that supporting cast, 32 a game on 65% true shooting.
With 7 assists.
Just like, man, his ability to stress a defense. Like you said, that combination of threes and free throws that he had, it's underratedly like top tier all time. Dame is an absolute monster. Any other gripes that you guys have? Anything
Any love
else?
for known scumbag Kevin Johnson?
Not this high, but I mean, KJ was a monster.
I mean, I do think there is a certain Jazz power forward who is also quite good offensively.
Yeah, cool. We got
But
to the scumbag section.
if we're bringing up bad people, I do like he was solid, but I'll never rank him. So if you didn't put him on the list, I'm perfectly fine with that.
You could make a tier 4 case for him, but he would not be in my top 3.
He would be in
playoff
a tier,
dropper.
he'd be
Playoff
in a-
dropper alert.
He'd be in a tier by himself.
I mean, KJ's a cheeky little shout, though, Logan. I mean,
I'd have Mark
was
Price
churning out
before
top
I'd
5
have Kevin
offenses.
Johnson. I'd
What?
have Mark Price.
Mark
I'd have Mark
Price.
Price before
That's
I'd
not a
have
bad
Kevin
take.
Johnson.
I mean, but listen, neither of those guys are tier 4.
Yeah,
they're tier 5 or 6 somewhere down there.
I do hesitate with Kobe a tier below Kevin Durant, but like, yeah, I would have Kobe and Harden tier 2. Those are like my bigger
That's fair.
gripes, and I'm just overwhelmingly quite low on Charles Barkley compared to
Really?
Yeah, I understand the efficiency. It's just for me, it's a heavy dose of ball dominance to generate that efficiency, and the way. I'm not gonna call it unethical. Like he played to the advantage he had, which was he was able to back down people for 6 years and generate good offense.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I think he was a very aggressive passer, but he did struggle with scoring blindness at times, and he wouldn't make some of the elite reads that I think the tier 1 or tier 2, tier 3 offensive players would. Dirk notwithstanding, but Dirk is a different case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think the offensive rebounding definitely does provide very strong value in terms of scalability, but the ball dominance, the dwindling of possessions, if his offensive attack does fizzle out and he doesn't have anything, you kind of are playing against the clock. It's a similar problem that James Harden might have had, where you don't have the opportunity to have multiple attacks within a possession with guys like Charles Barkley. I think that limits him. And I think he was a monster in transition, but in the half court, I think it's crazy because he led the league in efficiency, and I'm about to say his shot selection was bad. Like,
it's fair.
The amount of jump shots he took, like he shouldn't have been taking some of the shots he was taking, but he just took them anyway. And it's like you're wasting possessions doing those type of things. So that's why I'm lower on Charles Barkley. I probably would have him tier 4, not tier 3. But he'd still be on my list just because of how overall efficient he was and unique. How unique is a good word.
It's super unique. I mean, that's part of what I just love. You know, I'm actually working on a YouTube video right now that I've referenced a couple times over the last couple weeks, and I promise it is going to eventually come out. It's just the longest fucking video of all time, and it's an insane amount of work. But I watched an NBA game from every decade, and one of the things that I was talking about that I really love about the 80s and 90s is you have these super unique superstars like Chuck, like Clyde, who's this 6'7" shooting guard who jumps out the gym and is great in transition and can play, make, and cut, and great offensive rebounder, but like doesn't handle or shoot particularly well. there's no such thing as a star shooting guard in 2025 who doesn't handle or shoot particularly well. And like, that's what Clyde could do. Chuck was this 6'6", 250-something bowling ball post-up machine who was crazy efficient, got to the line at this elite rate. Like, dudes like that just don't exist in today's NBA, and I do think that that's pretty cool. But maybe I'm a little higher on Chuck off-ball than you. I think he did some good stuff as a cutter. He was an okay spot-up shooter. I would agree that he took too many jumpers. But, like, also, man, you look at a couple of the offenses, especially in the tail end of his Philly tenure, like 89 and 90. He's leading out top three offenses.
That's peak Chuck. I think that's peak Chuck. A lot of people say Phoenix Chuck is the best because obviously the finals.
Yeah.
But I think he was better in Philly, for sure.
I mean, the team that he had in 93 is just so much better. Like, they were an elite offense before he got there, and then he took them up a level. But I would agree. I would say 89, 90 is probably when you get peak Chuck. But, I mean, he was also incredible in the playoffs in 93 and 94. He's a great playoff guy as well, which is another reason I think he's clearly above, say, Karl Malone, who was, again, a playoff dropper. Any final thoughts, gentlemen?
Terrible human being.
Also a terrible human being.
Yeah, fuck Karl Malone.
On that note, fuck Karl Malone.